It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you to everybody who made this event possible, and thank you to you all for being here. Now, today's discussion has focused so far on the question of whether India can match increasing economic growth with growing political power. And in fact, it's this very question of the nature and the extent of the political power that India wields on the world stage that we too are trying to address within a current research project based in the Contemporary South Asian Studies programme. And it's about this project that I'd like to talk today. Now, the project's name is India in the Eyes of Others. And as the title suggests, it's a project that aims to present multiple viewpoints on India's influence in world politics. And it's also a very young project, so today I'll only be able to talk to a limited extent about our findings so far. But more importantly, what I'd like to do is to slice in at this moment in the project life cycle and talk a little about what we do when we plan and execute research in the social sciences and how and why it might be of interest to the world of policy. So in the next few minutes then, I'll be bringing together ideas about what research is, why it's useful, and at the same time I'd like to offer some insight into our project, India in the Eyes of Others. And I think two themes can help me bring these ideas together: epistemology and elephants. Now let's start with the first theme, epistemology. Now I know epistemology is one of those incredibly boring sounding words that makes people switch off their minds and switch on their phones and check their email. But an understanding of what epistemology is critical to an understanding of what we do when we do research. Epistemology is the theory of knowledge. How do we know what we know? And that's an important question because research is not just about adding to existing knowledge. It's about approaching existing knowledge in a creative and new way. Now, approaching established knowledge creatively helps us do two things. Firstly, it helps us question certain widely held categories. What do we mean when we talk about India's power and influence? What does it mean to be a rising power, a global power, a superpower? Secondly, approaching established knowledge creatively allows us to interrogate standard ways of answering specific questions. So a typical answer to the question, is India rising? Well, it might look at India's economic growth, it might look at India's increasing military capacity, it might look at India's proximity to the United States, or whether or not it has a seat on the Security Council. But how do we know that it's these factors that are more responsible for India's influence than others? So all in all, a creative approach to knowledge asks us to question accepted understandings of the world. Now, moving on to the second theme, elephants. Now, the term elephant is probably the complete opposite of epistemology. It's not alienating. In fact, it's almost too familiar. The well-worn comparison between India and an elephant is sufficiently boring that, again, people might start checking email. But please bear with me, because if we look at epistemology and elephants together, then maybe we have an opportunity to ask how we know what we know about elephants and India in a new way. So let's pick a popular representation of an elephant. Now, there's an Indian folktale that I'm sure everybody in this room is familiar with. Of course, it has many versions, but the basic plot is there are 6 blind men in a village, and they encounter an elephant for the first time. And they have to explore that elephant through touch and touch only. Now, the net result, of course, is that they end up with 6 very different readings of the elephant. The one feeling the leg thinks the elephant is very much like a pillar. The one feeling the elephant's belly thinks that it's like a wall. And so it goes on. The tail is like a rope, the tusk is like a spear, the trunk is like a snake, and the ear is like a fan. And of course, we know the blind men then fall into debate about what the elephant is really like. And it takes an all-seeing wise man in the village to reassure the men that actually each of them is right from their own perspective, but that a more faithful picture of the elephant comes from combining their different perspectives. And then, according to the tale, of course, all of the men are very happy that they've come to this wise insight and now have a richer understanding of what an elephant is. Now let's imagine we take an epistemological approach to this folk tale, asking how we know what we know about this folk tale. Now we might begin by pointing out that already this folk tale has an epistemological focus, because it very clearly and very cleverly shows that knowledge about the same thing is different depending on where you stand in relation to it. Now, keeping on with our epistemological analysis, we might question the reliability of the folk tale. The tale ends on a happy note, but how do we know what happens afterwards? Could it be that each of the blind men go back to their families and say, you know, those other men, they're crazy. The elephant really is only like a spear or only like a snake. Did they agree with the wise man only to keep the peace, or maybe out of some sense of respect or fear? We might also ask, what do we know about the wise man? Why do we privilege his composite reading of the elephant over any of the individual readings? And what haven't we asked? Well, what about the elephant? How does the elephant feel about all of these individuals clutching at it and making pronouncements about what it's really like? I don't know whether the elephant has access to a mirror, but might the different readings of the elephant impact upon its self-understanding, or help determine its next move or choice of how best to behave? Now, I think you get the idea about what an epistemological approach might look like. So let's move on to an overview of the project I mentioned before. Now, India in the Eyes of Others is a project that is trying to draw together global readings of India at this critical moment when we are told India's global stature, India's global influence is increasing. And our main premise in the project is that India's rise looks very different from different perspectives, much like the varied perspectives of the 6 blind men. So how a Brazil or a China or a Senegal or a Mexico see India's rise, clearly all of these countries encounter and interact with India in different ways, and each has their own understanding of what makes India influential. Now, an example from the project is a comparison between Eastern and Central European countries and Brazil, and their perspectives towards India. Now, one of the contributors to the project, Dr. Jakub Zajączkowski from the University of Warsaw, he's exploring how Central and Eastern European countries view India as a special kind of economic partner, because India, like them, is going through a process of economic transformation. Vinicius Rodriguez Vieira, also based at Oxford, on the other hand, is finding that Brazil sees India as a key partner on multilateral trade because of their common position as non-Western emerging powers. So the reason for India's importance, while framed in reference to economic linkage, is actually slightly different in each of these cases and tied to the self-understandings of the countries concerned. Now, India in the Eyes of Others also grapples with the issue of the wise man in the folk tale, who provides a particular unifying account that is apparently privileged above other accounts. Now, one of the central driving forces behind our projects is that existing perspectives on India's rise are really only being told in one voice, and that is an Anglo-American voice. And this is very limiting given the increasing multipolarity of the international system. For example, US readings of India's international influence tend to focus primarily on things like economic growth, on hard power, on India's democracy. And again, this focus may make sense if we appreciate that these factors are what make India a potential balance to China, but other parts of the world obviously have very different priorities. India in the Eyes of Others also takes into account the perspective of the elephant, seeking to explore how far perceptions of India from the outside match India's self-image. Now, clearly, as it's been stated this morning by Lord Patten and Mr. Salman Khurshid, the global role that India is seeking and practicing is built on a distinctive set of global experiences, and so Indian understandings of great power and global influence are distinct from Anglo-American understandings. So if an enhanced global role for India is to proceed along alternative lines, to what extent is there an uptake of this alternative image of a powerful nation? Within the project, we're getting answers to this question too. For example, Dr. Simona Vittorini of the School of Oriental and African Studies, who's actually with us in the audience today, and Dr. Dave Harris of the University of Bradford are examining India's development cooperation in Africa. And what they're finding is that some African countries simply see India as another pot of resources, whereas others actually do prefer India over China and the United States as development partners, because they see India as a specific kind of state, as a kind of champion of the developing world. Now let me conclude. I've only really been able to share with you today the early thinking, ideas and rationale behind this project. But what three key messages from all of this might be of interest to a policymaker? Well, firstly, we're asking what India's growing international influence actually means in practice. And our answer is this: probably several different things depending on where you sit in the world. And our thinking is that both we as analysts and the elephant itself need to know whether India is being perceived as a frightening snake, as a threatening spear, as a useful fan or rope, or as a reliable pillar or wall. Secondly, we're cautioning against measuring India's influence in terms of indicators that are selected only for a specific purpose and are only in the interests of one particular part of the world. The world, as we know, is becoming more complex, more interconnected, centers of power are shifting, and different stakeholders have different priorities. We need new narratives to capture the many nuances of India's international influence. Thirdly, because of our interest in uncovering these nuances, we are questioning some of the ideas we all have about power and influence in world politics, particularly as they apply to emerging powers in the global context of today. Why should we rely on just one voice to tell us about the elephant? What does the elephant really look like from different angles? And finally, and most importantly, how might the elephant respond to all of this? Thank you very much.